Getting married in the Middle Ages was a wild mix of romance, practicality, and just a little bit of chaos. Unlike today, when couples meticulously plan their weddings with the help of professionals, Pinterest boards, and social media influencers, medieval couples had to figure things out without any of those modern conveniences. There were no fancy invitations, no wedding planners coordinating color schemes, and certainly no viral wedding first dance routines. Instead, marriage was often more of a social and legal contract than a fairy tale event, though that didn't mean it lacked drama or heartfelt moments. For most medieval people, marriage wasn't about love at first sight. It was about survival, social status, and ensuring that the family line continued. Noble families arranged marriages to secure alliances, increase landholdings, or settle political disputes. A well-matched marriage could mean the difference between a lifetime of luxury and one of endless feuding. Imagine your parents setting up a wedding for you when you were still a child, deciding your future based on who had the best castle or the largest herd of sheep. Romantic, right? The concept of marrying for love did exist, but it was mostly a luxury for peasants or the exceptionally stubborn. Even without Instagrammable proposals, medieval engagements were still serious business. The betrothal was often a bigger deal than the wedding itself. It was a legally binding agreement that could only be broken under specific circumstances, like one of the parties suddenly deciding to join a monastery, or discovering that they were somehow related. Public declarations of intent were common, and some couples even exchanged a symbolic item, often a ring, a glove, or sometimes just a good old-fashioned handshake, because nothing says commitment like a solid handshake deal in front of witnesses. Weddings weren't necessarily grand affairs, though they could be if you had the money and status to throw a feast. The church played an important role in making marriages official, but not all weddings took place in churches. Many couples exchanged vows in front of their homes or in marketplaces with a priest or local official simply overseeing the event. The words spoken were usually straightforward, with no need for long poetic declarations. A simple "I take you as my wife" was often enough to seal the deal. No dramatic proposals, no meticulously choreographed aisle walks, just two people agreeing in front of witnesses. One of the more amusing aspects of medieval weddings was the church's involvement in setting rules. The church had very specific ideas about when it was appropriate to get married. Holy days, feast days, and fasting periods were often off limits, which meant that people had to be careful when planning their nuptials. If you thought modern wedding planning was tricky, imagine having to consult a priest to make sure you weren't scheduling your big day during a time of religious restriction. Some people even had to get special permission to marry during certain seasons because the church didn't want anyone getting too distracted from their prayers. Clothing was another area where medieval weddings lacked the uniformity we see today. There was no standard wedding dress, and white was not the go-to color. Brides simply wore their best dress, which might be blue to symbolize purity or whatever color looked best on them. If they came from a wealthy family, they might wear luxurious fabrics with gold embroidery. If they were from a poorer background, they might wear something practical that could be reused for special occasions. The idea of spending a fortune on a dress you'll only wear once would have seemed ridiculous to them. As for grooms, they generally wore their best tunic, sometimes with a bit of extra flair if they could afford it. There was no pressure to match, no bridal parties in coordinated outfits, and certainly no stress about finding the perfect shade of blush pink. Wedding feasts were where things really got interesting. Depending on wealth and status, a medieval wedding banquet could range from a modest meal with close family to an extravagant multi-day affair with guests getting progressively drunker as the festivities dragged on. Meat was a sign of wealth, so a noble wedding feast might include roast boar, venison, and swan, while a peasant celebration might involve stews, bread, and whatever local delicacies were available. Wine and ale flowed freely, and entertainment ranged from musicians and jesters to, in some cases, downright bizarre competitions. Some places had customs where the bride and groom had to perform silly or mildly embarrassing tasks to entertain their guests. It was less about refined elegance and more about making sure everyone had a good time. One particularly odd tradition in some regions was the bedding ceremony, where witnesses would escort the newlyweds to their bed and, in extreme cases, make sure the marriage was properly sealed. While the nobility took this rather seriously, common folk were more likely to celebrate with teasing, jokes, and maybe a bit of good-natured humiliation. This was also a time when fertility blessings were common, with some guests even throwing grain or nuts at the couple to symbolize prosperity and future children. It was the medieval equivalent of tossing rice or confetti, except sometimes the items thrown were much less comfortable to be hit with. Dowries and bride prices were a big deal in many medieval marriages. In some places, the bride's family was expected to provide a dowry, which could be money, land, livestock, or even household goods. In other areas, the groom paid a bride price to the bride's family as compensation for losing a daughter. The economics of marriage were often more important than the emotional side, and disputes over dowries sometimes led to bitter legal battles. If a bride's family failed to provide the agreed-upon dowry, the marriage could be annulled or, at the very least, lead to some serious family feuding. For those hoping for a quick and easy divorce, medieval marriage laws were not on their side. The church viewed marriage as a sacred, lifelong bond, which meant that getting out of one was incredibly difficult. Adultery, consanguinity being too closely related, or a previously unrecognized pre-existing marriage were among the few acceptable reasons for an annulment. Even then, the process could take years and often involved high-ranking church officials. Some people found loopholes by claiming they had never actually consummated the marriage, leading to some very awkward court cases where couples had to prove they hadn't, well, done the deed. Despite the lack of professional wedding planners, medieval couples still managed to make their weddings memorable. They relied on family and community to bring everything together, from cooking the feast to arranging the ceremony. In a way, medieval weddings were a lot more personal. There were no staged Instagram photo shoots, no pressure to have a picture-perfect venue, and no stress about getting a million likes on social media. What mattered was that the marriage was recognized, the families were satisfied, and the couple had a chance to start their life together with at least a little bit of joy. While modern weddings can sometimes feel overwhelming with all their details and expectations, medieval weddings were both simpler and more unpredictable. There was no formula, no industry churning out endless checklists, and no social media comparisons making people feel like their wedding wasn't grand enough. Instead, there were just two people, a lot of witnesses, and a general hope that everything would work out. In the end, maybe that's not such a bad way to go about it.